Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. She left just after sunrise for a quick scout near Joshua Tree and never came back. By nightfall, the phone went dark, and a marine town went quiet. In 29 Palms, a missing spouse isn't just a crime, it disrupts the base's daily rhythm. The terrain around the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center is vast, desert for days, riddled with old mine shafts, and it forces investigators to be precise from the start. The victim is Erin Corwin, 19, a Marine wife living in base housing. Late June 2014, she mentioned a short outing near the park. She drove out in the morning and did not return. The next day, when calls and texts remained unanswered, the case moved from family concern to formal action. There was no dramatic 911 call. Intake moved through base channels to county investigators, standard for incidents around a federal installation. Early work focused on facts, not theories. Detectives documented Erin's last verified activity, who she told about the outing, and the time her digital footprint went quiet. They secured call detail records for sector-level tower hits, 2014 appropriate, not app GPS, and preserved messages that set up the day. They canvassed base housing and spoke with friends and neighbors to lock down a clean timeline. No one labeled it homicide. No scene was declared. The priority was to narrow a search area that was far too large to grid blindly. Search managers built an incident plan in layers. Reachable pullouts and trailhead lots first, then the desert road network that looks drivable until it turns to sand, and finally the vertical hazards that define this region. Technical teams were consulted early because abandoned shafts require specialized descent and tight evidence handling. The goal wasn't to send more people, it was to send the right people to the right place. Back at the file, silence became its own data point. No banking activity, no routine social posts, no verifiable sighting in town. Investigators protected the vehicle as potential evidence if located and set chain of custody protocols in case the search shifted from welfare check to homicide. Outreach stayed measured. Requests for trail photos or dash cam clips from the park edge. Ranch owners near the mining districts were asked to report unfamiliar tracks. One line from the case notes captured the caution in the room. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Two guardrails for this chapter. We do not name a suspect here, matching the real posture of the case at this time, and we do not invent a house scene, cleanup, or struggle. As of this point, there is no confirmed crime scene, only a disappearance, a defined victim, and a map that must be narrowed by evidence. In 29 Palms, routine is everything. When a spouse vanishes, routine becomes a search plan. After Erin Corwin failed to return, command set an incident structure and moved from worry to workflow. Define the footprint, narrow it with data, and put qualified teams where risk is highest. No one called it homicide. This was a missing person operation with a large, hostile search area and a short timeline to find a living person. Search managers started with what could be verified within hours, not days. Erin's last known intentions, a quick scout near the park, put the initial focus along the approaches to Joshua Tree. Patrol units swept visible pullouts and trailhead lots. Nothing obvious, no disabled vehicle, no debris field, no distress sign. That negative finding matters. It moved the plan from roadside checks to a sector-based grid. Because the terrain is vast and uneven, investigators leaned on 2014 standard telephony, call detail records and cell site sector information, not app-level GPS. Requests went out fast to preserve tower hits from the period before and after Erin left home. Analysts plotted which sectors served the park edge and the surrounding federal land, then overlaid those arcs with practical access. Paved to dirt, dirt to sandy wash. The object wasn't to track a phone to a dot. It was to compress a map measured in square miles into pockets that could actually be searched. Vertical hazards dictated the next move. The region is pocked with abandoned mine shafts, some open, some disguised by scrap lids and silt. That risk forced a change in personnel. Untrained volunteers can sweep a trail. They cannot descend a vertical shaft safely or preserve evidence at depth. Cave and technical rescue advisors briefed the team. Gas checks, rope systems, edge protection, and strict chain of custody if anything is recovered. The message was blunt. These features can hide a person, a vehicle's trace, or critical items for months. If your plan ignores them, your plan fails. The grid was built in layers. First layer, High probability, low-risk locations you can clear quickly, parking spurs, scenic overlooks, sandy turnouts where a car might bog. Second layer, road segments that lure drivers off pavement and degrade fast. Tow and ranger logs were checked for any assist call matching the victim's vehicle. Third layer, the mining districts east and southeast of town, where sector coverage and access roads intersect. That third layer required staging, anchors, haul lines, a dedicated evidence tech at the lip, and a recorder logging every entry and exit. While search operations staged, interview teams tightened the clock. They confirmed the last verifiable contact with Erin and documented when her digital activity went quiet. They pushed for any detail that could sharpen the sectors, a favored turnout, a distinctive pull-out sign, a landmark she'd mentioned. Friends were asked to share trail photos and casual snapshots from recent weeks. Even a background ridgeline or a known cattle gate can save hours if it matches an approach road. Nothing yet broke the map wide open, but the absence of normal signals, no banking, no routine pings, kept the pressure on the narrowed pockets. Outreach to the public was deliberate and specific. Instead of a blanket call for tips, the request targeted people who were actually out there, off-roaders, hikers with action cams, ranch owners near fence lines that butt against BLM land. In towns like 29 Palms, crime investigations succeed when ordinary routines intersect with evidence. Someone reviews a clip, notices a compact car in the far edge of the frame, or remembers fresh tire tracks where there shouldn't be any. That kind of detail paired with sector data can move a search from miles to meters. The command post documented everything that could be measured: sector IDs, time windows, cleared pullouts, and any feature that warranted a second look. Nothing was assumed twice. If a site was cleared visually, it was logged as such. If a shaft was flagged for technical entry, it was queued with an entry order number. The discipline prevented two common failures in desert searches: losing track of what's been done and repeating tasks because the map feels bigger than your notes. By the end of the first operational period, the plan had shape and traction. The team had compressed an unmanageable landscape into a finite list of sectors and features. The most dangerous pockets were flagged for technical attention. Interviews had locked a clean pre-departure window. Digital data supported the emphasis on the park approaches and the mining districts without pretending to be precision GPS. Inside the file, one quiet line captured the mood. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean alignment without a fine keeps you cautious. It also keeps you moving. Before we leave this chapter, 2 integrity checks. First, no crime scene exists yet, only a search footprint. We are not inventing a house struggle, a vehicle altercation, or a cleanup narrative. None is supported by the record at this stage. Second, we are not naming a suspect. That is intentional and consistent with the real investigative cadence. The next step is simple to say and hard to execute. Descend where a person could be and where evidence tends to fall, straight down. In cases that start as a disappearance, the next move is proximity. Investigators work outward from Erin Corwin's daily life, home and base housing, close friends, and neighbors, to lock a clean timeline. The goal is limited and testable: who last saw her, what she said about leaving, and whether anyone expected to meet her that morning. The spouse interview set the baseline: a short outing near the park, ordinary plans ahead, nothing unusual inside the residence. That account was measured against preserved messages and timestamps. Friends independently confirmed the same plan: a quick scout, with no fixed trailhead named. Notes stayed precise. General intent to approach the park boundary, no verified sighting after departure. Digital activity, quiet after the morning window. Neighbors were contacted because they track patterns without trying to. Vehicles, first departures, returns. Among them, a former Marine who knew Erin socially acknowledged frequent casual contact. Interview tone remained clinical. Investigators documented access and opportunity but did not assign motive. The single question was whether any interviewee could place Erin at a specific location or meeting point. None could. With those statements logged, analysts compared them to the existing clock. There were no messages from Erin after she left home. Several witnesses referenced a special outing she had looked forward to in recent days. That phrase entered the file as a potential planning indicator to be corroborated later. It was not treated as proof of a rendezvous. A sensitive detail surfaced. Erin had privately voiced concern she might be pregnant and that the child might not be her husband's. That was recorded exactly as reported, an allegation to be evaluated against evidence, not a medical fact. It informed motive analysis in a narrow way. It could explain secrecy around meetings or destinations, but it could not, by itself, locate a person in the desert. Practical questions followed. Did anyone recall Erin naming a specific mining district, turnout, or fence line landmark? Friends described her interest in scenic pullouts and old sites. The neighbor's circle mentioned off-road spots east and southeast of town. None of those references were unique enough to pinpoint a shaft, but together with sector guidance from the telecommunications data, they justified assigning technical teams to a prioritized entry list. The vehicle variable stayed conservative. If Erin's car were located, it would be held and documented exactly as found with full chain of custody. If not, search operations would continue under the assumption it remained mobile somewhere inside the narrowed footprint. Neither assumption authorized speculation about an indoor struggle or roadside assault. As of this phase, there was still no confirmed crime scene, only a growing alignment between interviews and the sectors defined in Chapter 2. Interview cadence was structured to avoid circular narrative. First pass, last contact. Second, planned contact. Third, location specificity. New information, an unfamiliar turnoff name, a remembered gate, a mention of old dig sites, went straight to the search board. Repeats without substance were logged and set aside. The file moved forward by adding only what changed decisions. By the close of this stage, the social radius was manageable and operationally useful. Special outing language was confirmed by more than one source. A neighbor with proximity and access was identified as a person of interest through standard sequencing while denying any plan to meet that morning. The digital silence after Erin's departure continued to support emphasis on the approaches to Joshua Tree and the nearby mining districts. The next step wasn't speculation, it was field action at depth. The search plan finally moved from theory to terrain. One of the prioritized shafts, flagged by sector data and access roads, was selected for entry. Deputies established a hard perimeter, logged the first arrival time, and photographed the site before a single footprint crossed the crust. This was still a missing person operation, but everyone on scene understood what these shafts often mean in a crime investigation. Technical staff treated the opening like a lab bench. A multi-gas meter checked the air column. A weighted line measured depth and confirmed straight drop with debris ledges in the first third. A small camera went over the lip to survey shelves, supports, and the bottom. What the lens showed was enough to move from reconnaissance to recovery. Command logged an entry order and assigned roles: edge safety, descent, evidence technician at the rim, recorder, and second descender to verify and bag. Before anyone went down, the entry team documented the mouth of the shaft from 4 points: north, east, south, west. They shot scale photos of the collar, spoil pile, and any disturbed cover. The rope system went up: tripod, anchors, main, and belay. Every tool was counted out loud. Every bag was pre-labeled. The recorder noted time in, time out, item numbers, and who touched what. In places like this, contamination isn't just bad practice. It's a verdict problem later. The first descender reported the ledges were unstable but passable. At depth, he called out a quick inventory so the rim tech could build the evidence log in real time. Clothing consistent with the victim, a plastic beverage bottle resting off to one side, and materials that looked like components of an improvised light source. No one moved anything until the camera documented the bottom as found. Only after the full set of photographs did the team begin the slow process: mark, bag, and lift. Items were packaged for preservation, not convenience. Paper, not plastic, to avoid condensation. Each bag sealed and initialed. Each location sketched on a simple diagram: bottom center, southwest quadrant, near the wall. The bottle was capped and swabbed on the exterior before bagging. The torch material, fabric wrapped around a stick-like core, was packaged separately to prevent transfer. Nothing was cleaned in the field. The body was prepared for removal only after the loose items were lifted and the bottom was reshot to confirm nothing shifted. Extraction in a vertical shaft is slow and unforgiving. The body came up with deliberate movement, past the shelves and the throat of the opening to a private staging area behind screens. Deputies briefed the coroner investigator on the sequence and the item inventory that preceded removal. There would be a full autopsy later under controlled conditions. At the recovery point, no cause of death was stated. Determinations belonged to the pathologist, not to a hole in the ground. Once the scene was clear, the lead descender performed a second pass to verify nothing remained. No device parts, no additional personal effects. Negative findings matter as much as positive ones. They close out questions that can derail a case months later. The final step at the shaft was administrative and essential. Closing photographs, a 360-degree video pan, measurements from fixed landmarks, and a signed scene release. The perimeter tape came down only after the chain of custody forms were checked against the evidence log, line by line. Back at command, the priority shifted from location to linkage. The bottle would go for DNA comparison, so would the cloth from the torch apparatus. Clothing would be examined for trace and for any pattern that might speak to movement at depth. The lab schedule was written before the vehicles left the desert. Handling notes were read aloud to confirm who sealed which item and at what time. It sounds redundant until you realize redundancy is how you stop a defense challenge before it starts. There is a human layer at a site like this. Searchers who've walked miles of sand become quiet when a recovery confirms what everyone feared. Out here, people don't talk about closure, they talk about answers. Families can live with hard truth better than with missing. In towns like 29 Palms, we say murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Getting someone home, even from the bottom of a shaft, is part of that fabric. What changed at this point in the investigation is straightforward and significant. For the first time, the case had a confirmed scene, an abandoned vertical mine shaft on public land near Joshua Tree and 29 Palms. The map that had been shrinking since the first days now narrowed to one location, with evidence lifted under clean chain of custody. No one claimed a second scene. No one introduced a house or a cleanup that didn't exist. The file moved decisively from search to recovery and from recovery to lab. The handoff to forensics was immediate. The bottle and torch would either connect people to the bottom of that shaft or they would not. The clothing would either hold trace that explains movement or it would not. The autopsy would assess what could be assessed from remains recovered weeks after disappearance. At this stage, cause of death was undetermined pending examination. The strength of this case would not come from guesswork. It would come from items that tell the same story under different lights. The shaft gave investigators a location. The evidence bags would have to supply people. At the lab, the priority list was short and objective. Swab the plastic beverage bottle recovered at depth, process the cloth from the improvised torch, and examine the victim's clothing for trace. Each step followed written protocols, item photographed, seal verified, chain of custody signed before any packaging was opened. In a crime that will rise or fall on linkage, paperwork discipline is as important as any reagent. The bottle was approached first. A technician photographed the exterior, cap, and rim, documented surface dust, and noted scraping consistent with ground contact. Separate sterile swabs were taken from the cap threads, the mouth of the bottle, and selected exterior panels least exposed to soil. Controls were run alongside to capture background. Extraction followed standard STR workflows, with quantitation ensuring there was enough template to avoid stochastic dropout. The resulting profiles were clean, a two-person mixture on the mouth swab and a second matching mixture on one exterior panel. Reference samples were compared only after the blind run was complete. Reference samples had been collected under consent and warrant, the victim's known profile and elimination swabs from responders who handled the item in the field. A lawfully obtained reference from the person of interest, identified earlier through proximity, was processed in a separate batch, then introduced for comparison. The statistics mattered. The major and minor contributors on the bottle included the victim and the person of interest. The random match probability reported by the lab was consistent with a profile that would not be expected to occur by chance in a general population. Mixtures carry limits, and the report acknowledged them. Time of deposition cannot be measured from DNA alone, and low-level alleles at a single locus can be ambiguous. But the agreement across two different swabs strengthened the linkage. The improvised torch was next. Field notes described cloth wrapped around a rigid core, consistent with a handheld light source used in a dark vertical environment. The lab separated cloth from core, then cut interior and exterior subsamples to minimize the chance of cross-transfer. The interior cloth, less likely to have been exposed to sediment, produced a single-source profile matching the same person of interest seen on the bottle. The exterior cut yielded a low-level mixture that included the victim, a result the lab treated with caution due to potential environmental contact at the shaft bottom. Even with that caution, the interior cut was significant. It placed the person of interest in contact with a piece of equipment that had to be assembled and held by someone entering a dark void. Clothing recovered with the victim was examined for trace. Technicians documented soil loading and abrasion patterns consistent with an uncontrolled vertical drop and secondary contact with ledges. They combed for hair and fibers, vacuumed selected areas with filtered collection, and photographed any transfer patterns before removal. No single fiber tie would decide this case, but all of it built context, what surfaces a person encountered and how items at the bottom came to rest where they did. Negative findings were recorded with the same care as positives. If there were no foreign fibers of a particular type, that absence was logged, so it would not be discovered later as a question. Chain of custody sheets were read against the evidence log to ensure no gaps between scene, transport, and lab intake. Where bags showed dust intrusion or a seal needed to be replaced due to field conditions, a corrective entry was written, initialed, and time-stamped. That kind of transparency is often what survives cross-examination. A lab that records what went wrong, however minor, is a lab that jurors tend to believe when the results are favorable. With DNA comparisons in hand, detectives could start to align people to place rather than people to rumor. The person of interest had already been identified through interviews as someone with proximity and access. Now, independent items recovered at depth, the bottle and the interior cloth of the torch, showed that person's DNA alongside the victim's at the bottom of a vertical mine shaft. No single result ends a case. Together, results begin to speak, and they speak without bias. A bottle doesn't have a motive. Cloth doesn't lie for friends. Provenance questions were handled in parallel. Investigators asked where the person of interest had access to light-making materials and whether anyone in his circle had seen improvised torches used for exploring old sites. That line of inquiry was factual, not speculative. Who bought what? Who borrowed what? Who had reason to assemble a light source in an area known for deep, unlit shafts? Purchase records, if any, would come later. At this stage, the lab report itself was enough to justify the next round of interviews and a detailed search of locations tied to the person of interest's daily life. The lab also flagged an important limitation, and detectives put it in their notes so it would not be forgotten in court. Touch DNA can transfer, and bottles can move through more than one set of hands. That is why the interior cloth result on the torch carried more weight than the exterior of the bottle. The person who wrapped that cloth around a core and used it for light left a stronger, more direct biological trace where a secondary handler would not. In casework terms, that's a behavior-linked item, not something casually borrowed and passed around, but a functional tool assembled for a specific purpose. Throughout this stage, the autopsy work continued on a separate track. Remains recovered weeks after disappearance limit what can be concluded. The medical examiner documented condition, collected standard samples, and noted findings for later testimony. At this point in the file, cause of death remained undetermined pending examination, and the manner reflected the totality of circumstances around recovery and evidence. The narrative did not attempt to outrun the science. All conclusions would have to be supported by what could actually be measured. The social radius named a person of interest by routine proximity. The shaft established a single confirmed location. The lab placed the person of interest and the victim on the same items recovered at that location. The question moving forward was not whether to proceed, but how to sequence the next phase: digital timelines, movement analysis, and any further searches that could show where people were at the critical times. There is a human dimension even in a lab report. Families want to know that the work stands up to challenge, that there isn't a shortcut or a guess hiding behind technical language. The best reassurance is precision. Every acronym is a step that can be explained to a jury. Every statistic has a margin and a rationale. When community trust is thin, the cleanest answer is a result that can be repeated and defended. The lab work gave the case 2 anchors at the bottom of a shaft. The next task was to lock time and movement around that location using the data available in 2014, call detail records, and cell site sectors. No tutorials, no theory, just outcomes that could survive a courtroom. Analysts pulled the victim's call records and message logs covering the days before and after she left home. The pattern was steady until the morning she drove out. After that, there was no meaningful activity. No outgoing calls, no texts to explain a delay, no banking pings that would put her in town. That silence did not prove a crime on its own, but it justified why the search grid had been tightened toward the park approaches and the mining districts in the first place. Records for the person of interest, identified earlier by proximity, were reviewed under lawful authority. The device showed normal traffic in the days leading up to the disappearance. Then came a window starting around the same part of the morning the victim left, where usage dropped and tower connections shifted away from residential coverage. The sector serving public lands southeast of 29 Palms appeared during that window, consistent with travel on the approach roads investigators had already marked on the board. There was no precision pin, sectors or arcs, but the arcs overlapped the very pockets where technical teams later descended. Gaps mattered as much as hits. A stretch of quiet, no calls, no data pulls large enough to force a handoff, lined up with the period when the prioritized shaft could have been accessed and exited without traffic noise on the phone. When usage resumed, the sectors trended back toward populated coverage. That return path tracked with roads you would take if you were leaving the search area and heading toward housing. Those same records were compared to interview statements. The person of interest had denied planning to meet the victim that morning. The timeline on paper showed no contemporaneous calls between them after she left home, which the defense could later argue meant no rendezvous. The counterpoint was geographic, not conversational. The device for that person was being serviced by towers that cover the same corridors where search teams worked and where the single confirmed scene ultimately produced evidence. In situations like this, investigators treat contradictions carefully. If a claim and a sector map don't match, the map wins unless something better explains the discrepancy. Other potential leads were checked against the same standard. The spouse's device activity and work commitments did not intersect with the sectors covering the desert pockets. Friends who were on base or in town that day stayed within expected coverage. The point wasn't to clear anyone by sympathy, it was to reduce the list of people whose movements actually touched the problem area during the only hours that mattered. Analysts laid the phone windows over a simple travel model. It showed the earliest plausible departure from residential coverage, a reasonable travel time to the public land corridors, a quiet period sufficient for someone to access a vertical feature, and a return to denser coverage after. The model didn't guess motive and didn't pretend to fix a minute-by-minute track. It demonstrated feasibility and opportunity aligned with what the search and the lab had already found. One detail helped close the loop. The sectors active during the quiet window were the same sectors that justified sending technical teams to the strip of shafts that included the one where the body and items were recovered. It meant the digital record wasn't being stretched to match the scene after the fact. It had pointed there before the cameras went over the lip. The ask was straightforward. Authority to seize and search devices, vehicles, and locations tied to the person of interest, and to obtain any additional records that could refine the sequence. Store receipts, travel logs, or messages around the days that bookended the disappearance. Each paragraph in the affidavit carried something verifiable, a timestamp, a sector, an item number, a recorded denial. The medical examiner continued work in parallel. Given the recovery delay and the environment, the file still listed cause of death as undetermined pending examination. The manner drew on context. A young woman disappeared, was recovered from the bottom of a vertical shaft weeks later, and items at that depth placed her and another person there. The strength of the case was not the label on a death certificate. It was the way independent lines converged without being coached. Families often ask whether phone records really help. The honest answer is that they don't tell you what someone was thinking. They tell you where to look, when to ask harder questions, and how to compare statements to something that doesn't change its story. In this case, the sectors did their job. They narrowed a desert, they supported a recovery, and they helped write the paperwork that would move the investigation across state lines. The file had 3 pillars before anyone put handcuffs on a wrist. A single confirmed scene at the bottom of a shaft, DNA from items recovered at that depth linking the victim and a person of interest, and movement windows from call detail records and cell site sectors that put that same person along the corridors investigators were already searching. With those in place, detectives drafted affidavits that read like ledgers, times, sectors, item numbers, recorded denials, then sought an arrest warrant. Coordination moved beyond San Bernardino County. The person of interest had left California shortly after the recovery and was living in Anchorage, Alaska. Jurisdiction doesn't pause for distance. California authorities briefed Anchorage law enforcement and the U.S. Marshal Service on the warrant and supporting evidence, transmitted certified copies of the court orders, and confirmed the terms for custody transfer if arrest was executed. The packet included the scene report from the mine shaft, the laboratory results for the bottle and torch cloth, and the phone sector charts that framed the critical window. Arrest operations were straightforward. When contact was made in Anchorage, the warrant was confirmed, the individual was taken into custody without incident, and booking followed local protocol. Rights were read, property logged, and the California hold was recorded so the jail could restrict release. The booking photograph and fingerprints were transmitted back to California to close the identification loop. There was no public statement about motive. Affidavits already said what was necessary. Extradition is a process, not a bus ticket. California sent the governor's warrant package. Alaska confirmed receipt and scheduled a hearing. Defense counsel could contest identity or the legality of the underlying papers. In this case, extradition was waived. That decision mattered for timing. It allowed the defendant to be transported to California without prolonged litigation, which meant the case could proceed to arraignment where the formal charging document, first-degree murder with a lying-in-wait special circumstance, would be read. The chain of custody discipline that governed evidence also governed people. Custody logs tracked every handoff from Anchorage jailers to transport deputies and then to San Bernardino authorities, with times and signatures on each line. Parallel work continued on the ground in California. Warrants authorized searches of locations and vehicles tied to the defendant, focusing on items that could corroborate access to the desert corridors and the use of improvised light sources. Investigators looked for materials consistent with the torch construction documented by the lab, digital devices for additional telephony or messaging records, and clothing or gear that could hold trace. Results would funnel into discovery later. For now, they supported the charging posture. At arraignment, the court set procedural timelines. The case would track toward a preliminary hearing where a judge determines whether there's sufficient cause to bind over for trial. In filings, the prosecution outlined the structure: disappearance and silence, focused search leading to a single recovery scene, item evidence linking people to place, and device records showing a feasible movement window. The defense signaled familiar themes: challenging mixture interpretation, transfer possibilities on a bottle, and the limits of sector data that can't pinpoint a device to a single shaft. Those are legitimate arguments. They're also why the interior cloth result on the torch carried weight. Custody status remained firm. Transport completed, the defendant entered the California jail system and appeared in person under guard. The court issued protective orders to safeguard discovery and scheduled motion practice on admissibility, especially the telephony and the DNA mixtures. None of that altered the path of the case. The shaft remained the only scene. The lab reports stood on their paperwork. The phone sectors described a corridor, not a dot, and that is exactly how analysts had used them. Families in cases like this are asked to hold two truths at once, a process that feels slow and a case that cannot be rushed if it's going to hold. In towns like 29 Palms, crime cases reach court because small steps stack up. A search grid that doesn't lose track of itself, an evidence log that never leaves a blank line, and a warrant affidavit that reads the same on day one as it does the morning of trial. By the time Alaska handed over custody, the narrative wasn't guesswork, it was paper and timestamps. The file entered court as a record under oath. Jurors saw the mineshaft photographs one time, then the exhibits that mattered. The plastic bottle recovered at depth with a two-person STR profile matching Erin Corwin and Christopher Lee, the interior cloth from an improvised torch carrying a single-source profile for Lee, and sector charts showing his phone moving into, then out of, the public land corridors that include the shaft where Erin was found. Experts stayed within the science. Mixtures carry limits. Sectors are arcs, not GPS, and the torch's interior is a behavior-linked surface unlikely to pick up casual transfer. Chain of custody was intact from the desert lip to the bench. The defendant testified. He said he decided to kill, described a rear strangulation with a handmade device, and pushed Erin headfirst into the shaft. The medical examiner addressed what could and could not be concluded after a recovery weeks later. The file kept cause of death undetermined, while the manner drew on the totality of circumstances. The state's theory of lying in wait was simple: planning, position, and the use of a tool proven not by rhetoric, but by items recovered where only a prepared person would go. The defense pressed the expected points: DNA mixtures, alternative transfer, and the non-precision of cell site, but the record showed independent lines that met at one location. Instructions covered first-degree murder and the special circumstance. Deliberations were direct. On November 3, 2016, the jury returned guilty of murder in the first degree. Lying in wait found true. On November 29, 2016, the court imposed life without the possibility of parole. No alternate outcome, no second ending. Cases like this remind communities that careful searches matter. A disciplined grid, a clean descent, and item-level forensics can hold when memory fades. In a high-desert crime with no early crime scene, the work was the message. Don't guess. Document. Don't rush. Preserve. Families live with hard truth more than with missing, and communities hold when institutions do the slow parts right. I've walked you through this case the way we worked it: map, scene, items, truth. What I carry forward is simple. We keep each other safer by reporting early, documenting carefully, and refusing shortcuts. In a country this wide, discipline and community save lives and dignity. If this story reached you, tell me what part mattered most. What should your town improve? Trail safety, alerts, neighbor check-ins? Share respectfully, even if you didn't like it. Say why. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you want more real cases told straight, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for what's next.